Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephen. Today I'm answering your questions about writing that people have posted on the community tab. Let's get to it. Okay, the first comment that someone posted was they were told that agents won't straight up pick up your book representation if the book is more than one in a series. Okay, so this is another myth that I have to debunk. Probably, again, I'm sure I've talked about this before. Length of series is important, but if you have more than one in a series, that is totally fine. I'll give you an example. In the science fiction and community space, in particular in the fantasy, debuts are typically, not always, but typically trilogies. Go back and look at any of the series of the last 20 years. I debuted in 2015, mine was a trilogy. There's a bunch of authors on my bookshelf. Go and look at all of the top ones. They're all trilogies, you know, Andrea Stewart, R.J. Barker, Alexander Darwin, Richard Swan very recently. Just work down the list. Many of those authors who debuts are with trilogies. Sometimes they're duology, sometimes they are standalone. Depends upon the story, depends upon the publisher, depends upon the author and what they want to do with their story. If you go to an agent and say, here's the first book in my fantasy series, it's 27 books long, they're going to turn around and say no. If you go in and say 10 books, they're probably going to say no as well, unless there's a very good reason for saying yes. Here's an example from a few years ago. Adrian Tchaikovsky, his first fantasy series. Most people now know him for his sci-fi books, but his first traditionally published series was Shadows of the Apt, and this is a 10-book series. He went with his agent to Tor, and Tor said, but 10 books, that's quite a lot. However, I think he'd already written 2.5 or even 3 books, so they realised this guy's quite far ahead, he writes very, very fast, we could release them every 6 months. So for the first, I think 5 or 6 books, they were coming out every 6 months. However, he only got an initial deal for 4 books because he'd written 3, and whilst they were working on getting 1 and 2 ready for publication, he was writing 4. Once those had come out and they'd been published and they'd done fairly well, then he was re-upped of the publisher for another 3 books, and when they did well, then he got the final 3. If he'd gone in and said it's 20 books, I think they would have said no. These days, I can't think of a series longer than a trilogy in quite a long time in terms of fantasy. Sci-fi, it's a bit different. Sun Eater, Christopher Rocchio is probably one exception I can think of. It's more common if you do have a sprawling story that you want to tell over many books in the traditional space, to do it in a bunch of trilogies or a bunch of duologies or something like that. Nowadays, people talk about Robin Hobb and the Realm of the Elderlings series or world, and there's something like 18 books. She didn't go in with 18 books. If you go back to that first trilogy, it's just Assassin's Apprentice, which I've got here, and the next 2 books in the trilogy. Then she does something else, then she does the Dragon book, then she goes back to Fitz's story, and over the course it builds into this enormous interwoven story across all these characters and across all these different books. An agent, and equally a publisher, isn't buying vision. They're not buying, oh, I've got this fantastic 27-book series and it does this and that and the other. To be honest, they don't actually care about that. That's not what interests them. What they want to know is the book that you've written is good, and when they read it and they see that you've planned the story well and the characters all make sense and they can sell it, that it's commercial. If it does well, then you'll do more. And equally, if the trilogy does really well, they might say, right, that was brilliant, can you do another one set in the same world? That's more common. But if you go in and just say it's a standalone book with series potential, that is a great hook for publishers because they know they don't have to commit to a series that could potentially not do very well. What is common in trilogies sometimes is that the first book always sells really well, and you get a decline in sales and a decline in sales. Not always, but that is a common pattern. Or what happens is lots of people buy book 1, they don't really enjoy it, then nothing happens and the sales drop on 2 and 3. Or they dip in 2 and you get series waiters, people who are waiting for series to wrap up before they actually buy all of them. But if you go in and say it's a standalone book, and if it does well, they say, right, do another one set in that world. And if it does really well, right, now do 2 books or a trilogy. But you wouldn't go in with a massive plan of 27. You might have it in your back pocket. It might be somewhere in notes and you've got it all laid out. But I wouldn't share it with your agent and I wouldn't share it with the publisher. So from personal experience, my debut trilogy Battle Mage, Blood Mage, Chaos Mage, the Age of Darkness did really well at Orbit. The sales were strong, they really liked it, and they said, right, do another one set within that same world. I did have some ideas swirling around. There were some things that I wanted to work on again, some characters that I wanted to revisit. I thought their stories aren't done, but I hadn't planned that initially. That was kind of, oh, maybe I'll get to that at some point. Whilst I was working on that first trilogy, that was the only thing I was focused on. But because it did so well, I then did a second trilogy set within that same world. And that second trilogy has done just okay, so they didn't ask me for a third set within that same world. I then went off and did something else. But it's another myth, it's another lie, saying an agent will not buy a book if it's part of a larger series. Just isn't true. You just have to go in with reasonable expectations. It's more common to go in with a shorter series. It's more likely that you'll be successful with a shorter series. An agent will buy a trilogy or a duology, but I would never, these days within current year 2024, I would not pitch anything longer than a trilogy, even if you have it. But yes, agents will take something if it is part of a series. Just don't go in with a massive plan and say this is what you must do, because if sales start to dip, you'll never get to the end of it. So be modest and reasonable with your expectations. Okay, the next question is, what is the best way to introduce a magical system into a fantasy world without overwhelming the reader? I feel like my system is too complex. Okay, thanks for that question. So there's a couple of different ways you can go about it. I always talk about having a world Bible. This is all the material that I've been gathering and building up over the years before I actually sit down and start writing the book. And it's the same with the magic system. I have like the rules and structures and things worked out. And that's kind of the iceberg. But what's in the story is only like above the surface, is like 10% of that iceberg. You never get to all this detailed stuff. As long as I know how it works, as long as the structure is there, as long as I can't poke any holes in the story or indeed the magic system, therefore the magic system isn't just a MacGuffin to solve any story problem, then I know that it works, and then I can introduce it gradually into the story. So there are a couple of methods you can use. There are more than the ones that I'm going to talk about. The first one is to have the new person. You see this on TV shows and in books. A person comes in and talks to the expert and asks them questions, and therefore the expert tells them about the thing, how the thing works, and that's how you can communicate information to the reader without it just being exposition. One of the kind of bad things I've seen in terms of world building and in particular magic systems is that people use a lot of kind of data dumping, huge paragraphs of text that when the story is moving along nicely, there's flow, there's conversation, and they get to a thing and the story stops because the reader now is going to get a whole load of information that the author wants to tell them. But it's not always relevant to the plot at that moment, so why is it there? The answer is the author thinks the reader should know all of this information because they've built this magical system. So there's the expert model explaining it to the new person. That's one way you can do it. The approach that I take, which I think works better for me in my stories, is to trickle information in as and when it's useful and as and when it's required. So in one of my early books, in Battle Mage, there is a mage very early on in the chapters, and he's told people that he's magical and he has powers, and he says, do you want a demonstration? They're like, no, you're okay. A few chapters later, he gets into the first fight, and then he starts to use his magic, and we get to see him wielding this magic. However, there's also the character who doesn't really know much about magic, but he has the talent, and so he's trying to impart this information to him so that the other character has a better understanding of magic and his powers and doesn't kill himself in the process. So I'm combining the two. I'm trickling information in as and when it comes up according to the situation, but also I use the expert and the beginner model to explain bits of the magical system. The fact that you think this person who's at the question says your magic system might be too complex, maybe is, maybe isn't, I don't know. But you need to find a way to communicate the basic principles of the magic system to the reader without just laying in dumps of information and huge paragraphs of text. And the problem is, that slows the pace down and it just stops the story, and it can take the reader out of the story because now you're just explaining things to them. It's just full of exposition. Another way to look at magic systems is to go and find your favourite books, fantasy books that have magic systems in there, and look at how they have done it. Look at how the experts have done it. If I think about Robin Hobb with the magic of the wit in her Elderlings, Realm of the Elderlings series, it gradually trickles in. To begin with, we find, it's a minor spoiler for those who haven't read it, we find that the main character Fitz has this connection to animals and to a dog in particular, and he can't exactly read his mind, but he can feel what's going on. And this is just this thing that he thinks he has, this empathy with his dog. And it's only later on that he's told that it is magic that's called the wit, and he's then told that it's this evil thing and that it's this bad thing, whereas to him it's just this interesting talent. So there again, you could introduce the magic system as something we just kind of see, and it's taken as normal for this one particular character until you kind of zoom out and then you find out how other people feel about magic. Another example is Peter McLean's War for the Rose Throne series. There's 4 books. In this, there are some people who have something that's called the cunning. And to begin with, some of them are just sort of seen as herbalists, or people who have a bit more knowledge than other people about medicine, and that they can help people, and they talk about the humours of the body and this kind of stuff. It's very sort of basic. But then as we go on, we find out there are some people that have more than just herb craft and lore. They have this other ability to tap in to some primordial force, and he never completely explains it either. That's the other thing. You get into that debate of hard magic systems and soft magic systems. Hard magic is where you explain everything and you lay it all out and it becomes quite scientific, and I find that these days, I find that quite boring. I find it quite tedious. It robs some of the excitement and the joy and the unexpectedness of it if you laid it out like a kind of mathematical formula. That's really dull. It's kind of A plus B equals C every single time. That's not magic anymore. That's just science, and I find that robs some of the joy and the real kind of beauty of magic. So I prefer soft magic systems where you understand the limits, you understand the costs, you understand the basics of how it works, but you don't know everything. And I think that's a lot more interesting for me as a reader. So it could be if you do have a really complicated magic system, you need to find a way to take a step back from it and just present some of that information to the reader and to the characters in the story. They don't need to know absolutely everything about how it works, but if you do, if you've built it all up in the background and you know the limits and the structures and the cost, and that if this happens, this will happen, and the cost is this. So magic has to have limits, it has to have structure, and it has to have something to contain it so that it can't be a solve-all, as I've said, a MacGuffin, because otherwise magic just becomes tedious and boring there again if it can solve every single problem in every single situation in every story. So maybe find a way to do that. An interesting and gradual way to introduce the information, but also how much do you actually need to show on the page. It's the iceberg thing again. Show that kind of 15-20% and have the other stuff in the background so that if you can interrogate the story, the magic system holds up. Okay, the last question I'm going to talk about for today is what are some handy ways to flesh out side characters without blowing up your word count with multiple points of view? Okay, the first and the easiest way to do it is through dialogue. When your main character, your point of view character is talking to someone else, you can flesh them out through the way the person talks, through their attitudes, through their belief systems, through their likes and dislikes. And basically, if you want to add more stuff on a character, but you don't want to give them point of view chapters, and this isn't for every character, this is just for some that perhaps feature more in the story, I would do almost like a CV or a resume for that character for yourself. Just have it somewhere and write down a bunch of questions and then work out the answers for that character, and then used upon that you create a kind of structure for them to then how they interact with other people. So let's say you've got a character who's a really very religious, they're like a paladin character in a fantasy world. They don't swear, they're very careful about their diet, they exercise all the time, because they want their body to be as a temple and all that kind of stuff. That will very much come across through how they talk, how they communicate with someone. What if they meet someone that's very, very rough in a pub, who's swearing all the time, who's treating people badly, who's bullying someone? Straight away, your main character would see how this paladin would react to any kind of aggression or threats. And they wouldn't be sort of just laughing and swearing and wading in with violence straight away. They'd probably be a bit more thoughtful and careful and considered and try to kind of see the best in someone if they're that way inclined with their religion. The next way to do it, which links to the first, is thinking about how your main character, your point of view character, sees that other particular person, and that can kind of flesh them out depending upon, you know, not only how they talk and how they interact with people, but how they dress and how they hold themselves. If they're walking along and they've got a limp, your main character might be thinking, is it something that they were born with? Is it a disability? Do they have like a broken arm or their arm in a sling? And then that obviously tells you they've been involved in some kind of an accident or a fight. If they got cuts on their face and a black eye, there again, you immediately start drawing conclusions about this character. And that's another quick way to kind of flesh things out. Your point of view character forming opinions of this other person. That might not be right, but it's their point of view, it's their interpretation of this other kind of side characters that are within the story or within that particular scene. I talked about building a resume, but an even simpler approach is to think about, what does this other side character want? What is driving them? And in any particular scene where they're interacting with anybody, what is it that they want? Even if they're not the main point of view character, even if they're just a side character featured in the story or in this particular scene, if the story is from their point of view and you spun the camera around and suddenly the point of view character is now off screen, or, you know, they're the other character, what do they want? What are they trying to get from this interaction, this fight, this conversation? What do they need? What are they trying to achieve? Are they trying to cheat someone? Are they trying to make money? Are they just trying to earn a living? Are they, you know, are they a magic user and they're trying to conceal their identity? What is it that they're trying to do? And that should help you flesh them out a little bit in your mind, and therefore flesh them out in every particular scene. Now, I don't do this for absolutely every character. If I have you know, someone walks into a bar and they meet the barman and he gets a drink and you walk away, I haven't done that for the barman. The only thing he's there to do in that particular moment, in that particular scene, is to serve someone a drink. I haven't thought much beyond him, unless I'm thinking, this is a location I'm going to come back to more than once. That's when it's worth fleshing out that character of that location that you're constantly revisiting, creating that resume for them. Because if it's just a one-off interaction, it's probably not worth doing. But if this person is featuring over and over again in the story, then I would take time to build something about them, maybe something that they want, whatever their thoughts and needs and desires are, their family, their history, their jobs. Pay close attention to their clothing, the way they stand, the way they dress, the way they interact with other customers, and then the first person, the main character, the point of view character. Right, those are all the questions I've had from the community tab recently, so if you have any more, I will do some in the future. Just post them in there. But that's all I'm going to talk about for today. I'll be back very soon with another video.